Our reading from the Hebrew Scriptures today is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34 and verses 1 through 12. Listen to the word of the Lord as it comes to you today from Deuteronomy, chapter 34, beginning at verse 1. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Mediterranean, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to you and your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor was not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What a sad and a wistful tale we get today from the rare book of Deuteronomy. It's not the dying that's sad. People die in the Bible all the time, as in the world. It's the circumstances, which I guess is often the sad thing about deaths. At 120 years old, the Spirit leads Moses up to another mountaintop. If you know his story, you know Moses is always climbing mountains. And he goes to a peak of a Mount Nebo, a peak called Pisgah, and there the Spirit whispers in his ear, "Child, look west. Look across the river. This is what you have spent the last 40 years of your life working for. You get to see it, but you don't get to go there. You get to see it, but it's not for you. You shall never set foot there." And then Moses died there on the mountain, and no one knows his burial place to this day. You know, it's hinted elsewhere in the Bible that Moses did not get to enter the promised land because he had committed some sin somewhere back in the book of Numbers. And Moses' brother Aaron, the high priest, already died on a different mountaintop for the same reason. But it's nice, at least, that Moses gets to see what his life was about. He gets to see what his life accomplished right before the end. What a gift to catch a fleeting vision of what your life had been about. But I would suggest that maybe keeping Moses out of the promised land was a mercy and not a punishment. I mean, Moses? Do you really think he was made for the land of milk and honey? Moses, his was the wilderness and the stinging sands. His was the scorching sun and the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. His were the stony heights and the desert nights and the daily manna and water from a rock. Moses cannot sleep on a feather bed. New days call for new ways, and sometimes new people. I don't believe Moses is being punished. I believe he is being spared. You know, Winston Churchill was exactly the leader that the United Kingdom needed during the war, but he lingered too long, and he made a miserable post-war leader for them. He stayed after his day had faded, and he clouded his own legacy by sticking around too long. Have you ever made the mistake of trying to apply old solutions to new problems, of trying to relive a bygone day well past its expiration date? I have. In fact, I do it on a regular basis. Maybe you have too. In adult education last week, Kate Fletcher said, and maybe you heard her, she was wonderful to hear. She said, I like Kenya better. I just want to stay in Kenya. It's simpler, it's easier, it's slower. And that awakened something in me that I occasionally revisit. You know, I left Cameroon 23 years ago, and I felt the same way. I like Cameroon better. I just want to stay here. Let me kind of explain. My godson from Cameroon, Francois, will be in worship with us on November 12th. And he will be leading adult education on November 12th. I hope you'll come and hear him. When I was living in Cameroon, Francois was a poor kid who had no family support, who needed a safe place to live and a meal, and just somebody to care for him the way kids do. And so he came to live with me. He had grown up an animist, worshiping the ancestors, and I did not care. It has never been my intention to change anybody's religious faith. I never pressured him to convert. They called me a missionary. I was a terrible missionary. My belief was that if they were good people and if they were happy, their religion's working for them just fine. Francois was drawn to Christianity and got baptized on Christmas Day, 1996. They have church on Christmas Day there. And I was named his godfather at his baptism, but he just called me his father. And later I put him through college, which is affordable in Cameroon, and he trained to become a chemist, but his ever-growing passion for the faith and his natural giftedness as a speaker and a leader made me doubt that he would ever be happy working with test tubes in a lab. After 5 years, I left Cameroon. The time had come. It was at last time for me to go. I needed to go. I did not want to go. Everybody knew I needed to go, and go I did. And after I left the country, Francois first became a well-known religious personality on national radio. And then he became a popular evangelist on campuses. And after that, he went out on his own and started his own religious movement, almost like a church. A religious movement the likes of which I never thought I would have my name attached to. It's an international movement with followers in Cameroon and much of Africa and France and Canada. And they do faith healings. And they speak in tongues. And they believe in miracles. And yet, their theology is gentle. And they're open to the truth that people of other faiths are also acceptable to God. They name me as the forerunner for their movement, sort of a shadowy John the Baptist figure. And if you don't believe that, come to Adult Ed on the 12th. They call me their grandfather to my face, which is unnerving. But I'm so happy for Francois. He made the faith his own. He didn't just take what I gave him, he made it his own. He lived into it. My staid, Eurocentric way of being Christian appealed to him, but mostly it was a doorway for him into a faith that he could adopt and make his own, where he could find meaning and even make a very good living. And that's the way faith is supposed to work. We're supposed to make it our own. That's called incarnation. But I asked this question, and it just occurred to me as I was preparing this sermon. What would have become of Francois if I had gotten my wish And if I had stayed in Cameroon, if I had not left, what would he be today? I'll tell you what I think would have happened. I think he would have tried to do things my way. He called me his father. He kind of idolized me. He honestly wanted to make me happy. He was very devoted. He would have gone to the respectable seminary in the capital city, the one with professors from Germany and Switzerland, the one that I was nudging him toward anyway. And he would have become a regular pastor in the Reformed Church in Cameroon, and he would be serving 5 or 6 village churches where people meet in crowded mud buildings. It's called Wattle and Daub, the architecture. And where they would stand to sing the doxology after collecting the offering. And he would get paid in plantains and chickens. And I think he would be relatively happy in that life, but it would not be what he has become if he had done things my way. If I had stayed, my staying would have unintentionally stifled his potential and his faith, because he would have tried to be something that I wanted him to be, or that he thought I wanted him to be. If I'd stayed, he probably would have chosen to live in my shadow. Just in parentheses here, let me say, sometimes I think that Jesus got himself intentionally crucified because he knew that his followers would remain followers if he didn't leave them. If I'd stayed to live in Cameroon, it's a funny thing to think about. You know, I've never been interested in fame, obviously. But my unbridled ego whispers another truth to me, and it says, oddly, my leaving Cameroon made me far more famous in that country than my staying ever would have done. And I'm more famous there than I'll ever be anyplace else. New days call for new ways, and sometimes new people, new leaders. The call of Christ is ever forward, ever onward, ever upward. Alas, poor Moses, he almost makes it to the promised land, but not quite. Do you think he knows what's going on up there on that mountaintop? Up there on the mountain's height? Do you think he understands that his age, his era, is just drawing to a close? That a new one needs to begin here at the promised land. Now that they've finally arrived, they need something other than what they had through the desert. Do you think he's on board with the plan? Or do you think maybe he wants to set foot in the promised land too? A part of me thinks that he is wise enough to see that his was the wilderness, not the land of milk and honey. That his was the day that was ending, that it was time for him to go to whatever was next for him, and let his people go to whatever is next for them. The same thing had already happened, as I said, to his brother Aaron, the high priest, on a different mountain. But it's nice that Moses gets to see the promised land from afar. He gets to catch a vision of what his life has been about just before he dies. I hope that we will all get that. In that last moment, maybe, when they say your life rolls before your eyes, maybe we'll get to see our lives and all things will be made clear. And I hope that Moses understood that it was not a punishment. It was a blessing. It was a mercy to him and to everyone else. Now, I want to say this in brackets because it has nothing to do with my sermon. But I do that sometimes, don't I? The land that Moses saw from that mountaintop is embattled today. And it's over the question of who should be there and who should not, and who owns it and who doesn't. And many of us may be asking that question today. Who owns that land that Moses was looking at? You know, there were people already living in Canaan when the Israelites got there. And many of those people got murdered or pushed to the margins, but they were never entirely done away with. They were always there at the margins of that land. And here in this land, we know something about that, don't we? We know something about pushing people to the margins to make room for ourselves. The Hebrew Scriptures deem this the just punishment for those people, the Canaanites, to have their land taken away because of their idolatry and their abominable practices, which included child sacrifices to their dark god Moloch. The ownership of land has always been the subject of bloodshed and conflict. Ukraine, Sudan, Israel, Standing Rock. And while we totally, hear me say this, we totally support Israel's right to exist and to do so in peace, we also support the right of Palestinians to exist and to live their lives in peace. And so let's pray for a day when all people can once again plant their olive trees side by side with mutual love and mutual respect. A new day with new ways and maybe new people, maybe new leaders. It's just so hard to make way for the new day when the old day was so good to you. It's hard to make way for the new day when you have so much invested in the old day. Maybe like Moses, you understand the need for a new approach, for new ideas, for new leadership, a whole new understanding of what it means to be the person or for us to be the people that you or we are called to be in this world. You get it. But what now? Did you just go up on a mountaintop and disappear the way Moses did? No. That's a glorious ending. Most of us don't get those. You've got to be the change, as they say. We've got to be the change that we desire. You know, always on this last Sunday in October, we celebrate Reformation Day. Reformation Sunday because it was in late October, 506 years ago, that Martin Luther, the first Martin Luther, the reformer, acted on an impulse that many people were feeling. And sometimes my church history professor from seminary watches these broadcasts. And so, Dr. Wilson, I hope I'm getting this right. He acted on an impulse that he was not the only one feeling. A need for change, not just in the church, but in the world. A need for change, a need to wake up. The church, they believed, had become too top-heavy, and this is not a criticism of modern Catholicism. This is a criticism of the medieval church. The church had become too top-heavy, too rich, too powerful, too corrupt. They waged wars, they owned land. And some people like Luther and others were thinking, you know, people really ought to be able to go to church and hear the sermon in a language they understand. People ought to be able to go to church and read the Bible for themselves in their common tongue. People ought to be able to receive communion instead of just watching the priests serve each other communion up here, which was how it happened back in those days. And before Luther, people all over Europe had said to themselves quietly, you know, I want to practice my faith this way over here. This makes more sense in our times. The followers of Wycliffe and John Huss and the Moravians and the Waldensians, they all just tried to follow their faith quietly in ways that made better sense to them in their day. And they got smacked down for it. My favorite was Zwingli in Switzerland, not only because he had a great name, Ulrich Zwingli. He started his stream of the Reformation, which is the one we're descended from, just 5 years after Luther in a totally unrelated incident, which has been called the Affair of the Sausages. Instead of nailing something to a door, he dared to eat sausage during Lent, which is admittedly less dramatic than nailing your demands to a door of a church. And as I say, that's the line that this church is descended from. Sausage eaters. I'm sure it was sausage and egg breakfast casserole. Luther gets all the press as the founder of Protestantism, but he was not the only one. There were many people thinking those thoughts in those days. He just had the backing of politicians and princes to support him. And he was a force of nature. But Luther and Zwingli and Wycliffe and Huss, they were all just responding to something that was in the air in their times. People were starting to think You know, even kings ought to be answerable to the people that they're supposed to serve. Even kings should answer to somebody. Maybe, they were thinking, maybe the Pope could be wrong sometimes. He's a human, isn't he? Maybe the bishops make mistakes. Maybe, just maybe, people are equal in God's eyes. Okay, probably in those days they thought men are equal in God's eyes. But that's why the church keeps changing and growing, and so does history, and so does our awareness. Maybe they thought that old hierarchy of being was just so much hogwash. Maybe even the church should be governed democratically by committees and session meetings, as long as they don't go over 90 minutes. The question of human worth is still with us today, and it probably always will be. But 500 years ago, it reached a breaking point. Things just had to change. They had to change. They could not go on the way they were. And change they did. Democratic principles began to go mainstream. That was kind of partly what the Reformation was about. I have to wonder for myself sometimes if I had been a clergyman, and they were all men back then. If I had been a clergyman in those times, which side would I have been on? Because I'm not sure. I've worked for the church since 1995, and I don't want it to change. 1495 or 1995, I went into the ministry in part because I liked the church the way it was. And no matter how much you recognize the need to change, it is hard to do so when you have so many dogs in the race, when you have so much invested in the way things are. But you know what? It doesn't matter what side you or I would have been on 500 years ago, because the lines are being drawn once again today. And some say it happens every 500 years, I don't know. And it doesn't take a Moses or a Zwingli or a Luther, if you must, to see that massive sweeping change is upon us, the church and the world, once again. Cultural change, societal change, religious change, and we need it. Things are broken. It's time to change. A new day is upon us, and it calls for new ways of responding, new ways of doing mission, new ways of following Christ into tomorrow. It's exciting, and it's exhausting, and sometimes I think more exhausting than exciting. Might be easier just to curl up on a mountaintop with Moses and disappear than to face a new day and try to think of new ways of doing things that we've already been doing. Let that new day happen without us. But we're not Moses. We don't get these glorious endings. And that bird's eye view is reserved for those who do not have to make the slog into the valley. You and me, we got to make the slog. You and me, this day was made for us, and we are called to meet it. We are called to rise to it. And so, to commemorate the Reformation of 500 years ago, we sang "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" because it was written by Martin Luther. And we will sing "I Greet Thee, Who My Sure Redeemer Art," which we only sing once a year, because it might have been written by Calvin, John Calvin. That's fine. We stand on the shoulders of giants, but the only way to honor those giants of the past is to do in our times as they did in their times, which is to respond to the day that has been given to us, to live into our day, to be faithful in our day, to let go of things that hold us back, and to respond to the forward call of Christ today. You and me, our heads are spinning. Our heads are spinning for all the change in our world today, especially since the pandemic, and we want it to stop. Church, many of us feel, is the one place where things should always be the same, but stop it will not. Let me ask you personally, where in your life are you clinging to something or even someone that really needs to be let go. They were good or needed in their time, necessary and helpful, but maybe that time has passed. To what or to whom are you clinging in ways that are only holding you back and keeping you stuck? And let's think about our society. Where are we allowing the leadership or the values of a bygone day to cloud our vision and to stifle our growth into tomorrow? I have to say this, have our current gun policies been serving us well? Do you know that the shooter in Maine parked his stolen vehicle 1 mile from Beth and Cal Wilson's house? Beth is a member of this church, and Cal was the interim for years. And I'm sure he'd have willingly, happily shot them too. Or us, or anybody we love. Every nation in the world knows to limit the availability of guns. But some old and already very rich men are getting even richer as they grow older by the way things are, by convincing Americans that they need weapons developed for the Vietnam War. Must we cling to these broken values that have done nothing but hurt us? And on this Reformation Sunday, where must the church change if we are to be the people of God tomorrow, the people of God today? What must we leave on the mountaintop with all of our gratitude for its past years of service and guidance, but knowing full well that it cannot lead us into tomorrow? And I heard this just yesterday. I have to insert this. My sermon is longer than usual today because the choir is doing less. Somebody said to me he heard a preacher say, all these kids spend all their time on Facebook, and of course, kids have nothing to do with Facebook. Oh, these kids spend all their time in Facebook and they ought to be in the book. How out of touch can we be with the world around us? How out of touch we've been. Changes are coming to this world and to the church. We know that. Things we cherish will go away, and we're allowed to grieve for them. Even the Israelites grieved for 30 days. But let us also rejoice for the new day that has been entrusted to us, confided to us, given to us, so that we could rise to it. The kingdom of God, like that promised land, is always almost here, but never quite. Amen.